Okay, so this is the last track I want to analyze, at least for the kind of like the pre-made tracks. So this one I think is extra important. This was the most recent track out of all three of these. This was the most recent one I did. So let's see when this one was done. This was done on April 8th, 2019. I spent 5 hours and 48 minutes on it. Now, this one is important because this is actually in a game. And I got paid $500 per minute to do this stuff. So this kind of shows you the progression, right? The first track I showed you, I made $50 for 30 seconds. Okay, so that was the track. So the biggest thing you should know for this track is that I start to use more like advanced techniques, like the little brass triplets and stuff like that. Really gives it more of a lively kind of orchestral flavor. And again, it's all about that balance between traditional orchestra and like the modern really hybrid stuff. So I have synths, I have sound design, and I have traditional orchestration with everything panned, the strings, the brass, everything like that, as I was talking about panning earlier. And I use a lot of stuff like this, brass rips. These are horn rips, stuff like that. Again, goes back with that, what I was saying about ear candy, how this adds so much realism and a human touch to it. Like, you have to get samples of this. You're absolutely not going to be able to recreate that rip by using like a horn sustain, right? So it's all about like the techniques they use and stuff like that, and having advanced articulation so you can really get something like that. Because that adds so much when you're just kind of bringing everything together with that kind of massive brass sounds. So there's a lot of different layering here with the choir here. And so I use like multiple string libraries. Here's Jaeger, which is nice lush sound, and then I have Berlin Inspire. A lot more crispy. You can hear the more detail, the bow sound and everything like that. So it's very important to layer things like that and really get to know your sample libraries. So that's why, you know, I had all these different recommendations. I own everything that I recommended to you guys. I own it. Okay, so I can vouch for it, and I often layer them all together. So you'll hear in this song how it's a marriage of, again, like the modern sound design and kind of synthy sci-fi styles, and then I also have traditional orchestration. Let's analyze that first part right there. There's that sound right there. Light ambient sounds like this I just love adding them over top. And so this falls into like the sound design, again, ear candy, where once you build that track, add stuff like this over top of it. It fleshes it out so much. Don't overdo it. So that's fairly simple. It's just strings and like this over top of it, but it just rings out and it gives it an ambience and a mood that's instantly like a sci-fi type of mood to me. So just in that intro part, we have a lot going on, and you'll hear how I have the synths coming in and building up like this. So that is really just replicating the strings. And you may wonder why I chose this melody here. Now, the company had a temp track pretty much. They had been using this a couple different tracks just like in their demo and stuff. And one of them was a guitar rock track that had this exact same melody being played on a guitar. So all I did was take that, literally, and put it into my song. They said, we want something with that same melody, because it was just, you know, in the intro and it was a totally different tempo and a different feel, but they said we want that. So I changed the key of it and kept that melody in there. So you hear there, of course, the huge hit is coming from this. So even if you don't have like a sound design library focus on that type of sound, layering synths with the brass and stuff like that is a really good way to add power and, you know, size and just give this massive sense of scope to sounds like that. And I also have the huge brass ensembles right here. Once that hit comes in. And this, I can't reiterate enough, again, is how important it is to have movement and dynamic playing like that. I know it may seem like sometimes it might be better just have everything blasting, right? Just have this brass blast like full out. But to me, it is so much more powerful to have the Brahm hit and have that brass slowly swell up. It just gives it like this brooding, massive sense of space and scale. So that's what I did there. So again, it's all about layering these different sounds and you know, taking a few different passes and you write the main strings part, and then you listen to it a few times. I just play it over and over and I say, you know, what else do I need right here? And you can either write like that in sections, or you can kind of write out the strings, the short strings for the whole song. And then as you play it back, you say, okay, this part needs, you know, a little bit of piano. This part needs a little bit of brass, a little hit right there, stuff like that. So just analyzing that little section right there, you'll notice I have the kind of brass triplets there, which again to me instantly gives it a more like traditional orchestral feel. It sounds sort of like something that John Williams would do, in a Star Wars track or something. I know this is like, I knew this game was like kind of an outer space, heroes versus villains tower defense game. And then it had a sci-fi, like other planetary kind of feel to it. So that's what inspired me to do that. And then you also notice I have that steady, constant driving rhythm. And what I do with that is I have a drum kit, which is right here, just doing the cymbals. Somewhere I have snares that I can hear. There we go. There's the snares right here. Now, that gives it, again, like kind of a militaristic vibe, because I know this is a battle theme and it's going to be heroes versus villains, and, you're going to be like amassing your troops and all this stuff, even though it's a sci-fi galaxy type game with setting, and so I have like a militaristic vibe with those snares. You hear how much those brass rips add to that part. Like, it was very sparse when, obviously I'm isolating certain layers, but I had the synths, then I added the strings playing that low droning root chord moving, and then I added those brass rips, which again, along with the brass triplets, those short bursts add really a sense of like this classical, traditional orchestral to it. So you hear that measure is where I kind of stripped things down, and I had everything building up fairly progressively and adding layers, and then I had the big kind of the first climax, which went on to a next section, which then stripped things down to just like the cymbal, and those strings were lighter. So you can definitely hear that, and then also showing you more how I use like the triplets here. So instead of keeping everything with like 16th notes and stuff, adding little triplets here and there and little bursts of brass, maybe just like the trumpets coming into one corner, having little bursts there with the triplets, little things like that. Again, details, adding those details in is going to be essential into really selling the whole track. You also might notice this one sounds more realistic, in my opinion, than the other two. So at this stage, I started really focusing more on reverbs and how to use them correctly, and having different reverbs for the strings, the brass, and keeping it all in one room. So I have talked about this a little bit in one of the live streams, but again, I'll go over it. I used two different reverbs for especially when I have dry samples mixed with wet ones. So dry means that they're just recorded in the room and there's pretty much no reverb at all. There's no room sound, no air. And then I also have libraries like Spitfire. Those are very, very wet, and that's kind of the selling point of those libraries, because they're recorded in this legendary hall, and you want it to sound so realistic, like you're actually there in that hall, which absolutely works. But when you're blending different libraries together, say you want to blend a dry library with a wet library, that's where things can get difficult. So I use different reverbs for different things. Like here is East-West Spaces 2, and this is just a fairly simple one, but it's the Southern California Hall, Orchestral Hall. This is just a full orchestra reverb. So that's pretty much as simple as you can get. So this is a convolution reverb, which will really emulate the space of this particular place, recording impulse responses, how the sound bounces off the walls, how the sound travels across the hall when you're standing there in front and everything, and they're different distances away from where you're actually standing. So I use a convolution reverb like that on my orchestral instruments. And then I also use, on the main bus, a lot lighter, I use this one, Valhalla Room Reverb. You can see right here is preset large hall, but it's a very light setting. This is about 12.4%. So I do that because, like I said, with the libraries like Spitfire, they're already really wet, and I don't want to get them too much reverb. So I take the sounds that are dry, like Jaeger or 8DO stuff, and I send them through the convolution reverb. So you can hear, there's no reverb at all right now. That's perfectly dry. So then I send it through two different reverbs, and that really gives it a sense of space. So I send it through the convolution reverb to feel like it's in a big hall, just like the Spitfire would be recorded in. And then I send everything through this Valhalla Room to make it sound like they're in the same room. Right? It's just an additional glue to keep everything together and everything focused. And you know, there's a lot of experimentation with that into getting the perfect sounds. But for orchestral music and hybrid music, it's always best to pan everything. And according to a traditional orchestra, that's how you want ultimate realism. That's how you achieve that, is panning and reverb. It's all about that. So that's a brief overview of how I do that. So another thing you might notice with this track is it is fairly repetitive, but it's not repeating the same thing. It's always progressing. So we have like that first intro section with building that main string melody, and then we have these little breaks in between that go like this, a little bridge. Hear how there it's pretty much just the brass and strings, and then when I have it down here, I continue to add more to it. So you've got a different counter melody going there with the strings and with the synths, and I've got the choir, and so every time I bring that section in, that bridge, I'm going to add more to it. So that's something about the progression, and then also about like the progression of this song. Hear how we start off really action-packed with that. We have the Brahm, we have these huge reverb synths just ringing out, and then once it gets into the next section, like I said before, I strip it down quite a bit. So you can hear there's a lot less going on there. The strings are quieter. There's not those like huge hits and everything. It's all a little bit toned down. So it just goes to show you again like the kind of living, breathing way that this song will move with the battle. So the battle in the game is a tower defense game and will be fairly long, actually really long, right? And if you just had it like in the intensity just ramping up constantly, it would get relentless, it would get grating, it would get irritating. So while I do repeat sections and stuff like that, and I build, I also take away. So it's not always about adding more layers. It's a lot about stripping them away sometimes and bringing it down just to the core elements of that track. Keep it driving, keep the rhythm going, but take things away and bring it down to a lower level. It's still intense. It's still got that steady driving rhythm, but it's not going to just beat you over the head with it. So that was that. Those are a few different tracks that I have made. Now, there's so much like to cover with this. So this is all just, again, battle music for a fairly simple structure of sci-fi and fantasy. So again, we're going to get more in depth with it, and I know someone commented that they wanted to see my process from start to finish. Well, I have kind of described my process about how I start with percussion and strings and start with a rhythm and melody. Then I also might want to do a full episode just focusing on creating a song completely from scratch, depending on like what kind of genre you guys are most interested in. So that has been battle music and a little bit about how I approach it. All right, guys, so one last thing before I move on to the closing section and do the Q&A and everything, I will show you one last portion of that track that is obviously going to be exclusive to video game music, and that is I wrote two different endings for that track. One ending if you win the battle, it's a victory theme, and then one ending if you lose the battle. So it's going to sound something like this. These are just the endings. So that is what plays if you win the battle. And then if you lose the battle, it's a bit more sad. Kind of like, an old school failure theme. So that's something that's going to be exclusive to video game music like this, where you're focusing on a battle that you can win or lose. Some battles you lose and it's just game over, but like tower defense or a game like Clash of Clans or something, you can definitely lose the battle. So what they're going to do is they're going to be able to piece this track together based on how I write that. So whenever the battle ends, the song will end. So even if it's going like this, they'll do stuff like that, how whatever portion of the song is actually going in, you keep it the same key and you just have a little transition like that continues that same melody, that same rhythm, and just ends it with either a positive note or a sad note. So that is a little bit how you do dynamic victories and endings according to the current track that you're working on. All right, so before I go to the Q&A, I guess just like some final closing tips, just like the last video. I again want to reiterate the importance of building relationships and networking as a composer, no matter what you're doing, video games, film, anything like that. Because that last track I just showed you, I told you I got paid $500 per minute. Now, I got really lucky with that, okay? That is not going to be standard for someone who's just starting or anything like that. But it also kind of shows you like the range, like, my next project after that was nowhere near that much. So I don't let it get to my head and I say, no, I only work for this amount because I did it once, right? That's a way to kind of, piss people off and And don't let it get to your head like that. You know what I mean? If there's a project you're excited about and they say, I'm sorry, my budget is not quite that, I can offer you a little bit, and it's like 10% below your rates, I would do it. Me personally, everyone's going to be different. You have your own way of doing things. I'm telling you, from my perspective, I take chances. It's absolutely necessary in this industry is to take chances, and I just like working with people. If the guy was an asshole and I didn't really like speaking with him, and he said, I can offer you 10%, I'd probably be like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do it. Right? It just judge based on things like that. So that, again, back to my point, so I get sidetracked too much. Back to my point about networking and relationships. That last game that I got was a very nice pay, and I got that specifically because of a friendship I made. If you guys remember my little demo reel in episode 1, the first game that I showed in that reel was Rolling Sky 2. This was the first really, really large scale game that I worked on, and I did not have much experience whatsoever when I did that. Now, I became friends with the art director of that game, and he's the one who had another friend making that tower defense game, and he said, hey, they need music. And I got that gig specifically because I built a positive relationship and a true friendship with the art director of the previous game. And this will also go into something else, how those two game companies are in China, and how stressful it was for me here in Baltimore to get messages at like 4 a.m, and I really wanted to impress these people, right? Because I didn't have much experience whatsoever when I was working on Rolling Sky 2, and it was very intimidating. It was really, really exciting, but it was scary. It was intimidating. And so I would, I'd get these messages at 4 a.m, and it was a lot of back and forth. It's a whole lot of back and forth when you're have clients across the world, and everything is based on the internet. So don't be discouraged if you put everything into a track and they don't like it, or it's not what they're looking for. I know 100% it can be hard because music is such a personal thing. Any creative outlet, we're putting all of ourselves out there to create this music. It's expression. It's not just like making someone a sandwich or something like that. This is like a deep personal thing. They want you to convey emotions and these deep personal feelings with a track, and you do your absolute best at it, and sometimes it's not what they're looking for. And it can be pretty discouraging when they have like a ton, a list full of things they want to change. But you can't let that get to you whatsoever. You have to be able to take criticism, even if they say, this isn't what I wanted at all, it's not very good. Sometimes your first reaction is to be like, well, screw you, right? Because I put so much time into that, and I know it's good. You know it's good, right? Don't let anyone else tell you your worth and stuff like that. Just because it's not what they're looking for doesn't mean it is not a good song and that you're not a good artist. So the thing about that also is you might have to deal with language barriers, which make that part even more stressful because it's hard to convey ideas. So how do you solve that? Well, I always ask for reference tracks with any client I have, no matter what it is, no matter how simple it is. Why? Because music, like any form of creative expression, is going to be very difficult for people to convey what they really want without showing you an example of exactly, like, say someone comes to me like, I want an epic trailer track. Okay, that is such like a broad thing. Sometimes trailers have pop songs in them, remixes, like a pop song remix. Sometimes they have dark, crazy sound design. Sometimes they have epic horns. Sometimes they have a choir. Sometimes it just has strings and stuff like that. But you really don't know what they want. And so I asked for a reference track. Now, what this does is it shows me the mood, and it shows me the orchestration and the instruments used. Because sometimes that's just as important. A lot of times people don't know what to ask for. People often ask for something like the Avengers theme, right? And what I realized what they want is something with a positive, uplifting vibe and really heavy horns. They don't want something, exactly like that, obviously, and you're going to make it your own. But to find out what they really want, ask for reference tracks. It is essential for me personally. And never copy it, of course. Add your own spin to it, but use reference tracks as inspiration for mood, the general feeling, and the instrumentation, whether it uses orchestra, whether it uses synthesizers, whether it uses, drums and choir, stuff like that. So that's just a little bit of tips, closing tips for you guys. All right, so let's go and do a Q&A. Let's read the comments. Michael Nielsen, I have a feeling your audience already knows this. I would like some much more advanced knowledge. I absolutely understand, and the reason I started so simple is because a lot of people aren't familiar with orchestral music, or they do electronic music. We have a lot of producers or just musicians who maybe play guitar in bands and stuff. So I really wanted to start simple for people who are just getting into it and want to make the transition. So that is why I had such a broad focus on that one. But of course, there is a lot more to come for that. Now, thank you so much for making this informative video. I'm a university professor teaching electronic music composition to students interested in music for movies and video games. Which current software platforms and plugins do you think are the most essential to master in today's job market? So I do think that for Mac, Logic Pro X, and for PC, Cubase Pro are the industry standard, so to speak, for as far as like composing for with virtual instruments and for MIDI composing. They have the most advanced tools for manipulating MIDI information and stuff like that. For recording, I think still Pro Tools, and for mixing and stuff, Pro Tools still seems to be the standard, but I would advise to get into either Logic Pro X or Cubase Pro accordingly. Cubase is on Mac as well, but Logic is only on Mac. But those two, I think, easily are the most popular and the most well-known. So even in that aspect alone, it's worth investing into that, so that if you ever collaborate with people in different studios, you kind of all know what is kind of known as the gold standard. So, and for plugins, I think I definitely mentioned that in the last video, like the orchestral plugins and stuff like that. And as far as plugins for like mastering and stuff, Ozone 8 by Isotope is, really, really good. Sonable, Smart EQ2, and the Smart Comp are my go-tos for like EQ and compression and stuff, but other people love Fab Filter. So those also can kind of do what your stock plugins can do, just a lot easier and a better looking interface. So I think if you're starting out, your DAW, your digital audio workstation, will have most of the plugins that you need already in there, and it's best to start with that, besides like for investing in sample libraries for realism and stuff like that. So what do you say are the most important skills college students should master in seeking to establish themselves along this career path? Again, like I said before, really practicing writing music every single day. I've been doing this for a really long time, and I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have so many failures along the way and stuff like that. So, I mean, I've been making music since I was like a little kid. I played saxophone in band and stuff like that. So I think having a background like that is really essential. But as far as today's market with virtual instruments and stuff like that, the best thing I would say is, college students, they're already on a good path. If they're getting a career and they're taking classes for that, that's absolutely like a fantastic place to start. But I think even more important is networking with people, getting to know people in the actual field. And I mentioned that the episode 1 with joining Facebook groups and Discord chats and stuff like that. So there is a Hans Zimmer masterclass online. And actually, most of the really good friends I've met online in the composer community, it all stemmed from that. So that's just an example. We all took this Hans Zimmer masterclass, and then people started a Discord group, which is a live chat. It's more for gaming, where people live chat and with their mics and stuff like that. But they started a group there just for composers, and they had daily like projects and stuff. Like they would have like hour challenges. You all had to compose a piece in an hour based on the same theme. So there are Facebook groups like that as well, like virtual orchestration, film scoring and orchestration applied, film scoring practice. There's stuff like that. I might be getting the name slightly off for this, but I can list those in my article as well. But those are such good places because they will give you a scene maybe, and like for a film or something. I know we're talking about video games, but the skills still apply, right? Learning how to score and use these instruments to create moods and stuff like that. So they'll have little, challenges like that. I know one is called Professional Composers, and I do the challenges in there a lot, where he will give you a topic or a theme or maybe a certain instrument you have to compose with, and then you have a week to do it. Everyone submits their piece, we get feedback, and then he picks his favorite compositions, he features them on the website. So stuff like that is absolutely essential. Building friends, building connections, getting your work out there, but more importantly, honing your skills. So, thirdly, I was wondering how much production work is done with live musicians these days versus work done solely with electronics. Now, I can tell you that even some of the biggest video game scores, like the past decade or the past 20 years, like Skyrim, that was 90%, virtual instruments and samples. I know they recorded the choir live, but Jeremy Sewell, the composer, has been like very honest and upfront about this. 100% almost, about 90% was samples, and you'd never know the difference. So having live musicians really does set your work apart, and it makes it so much more realistic. I mean, there's certain things you just aren't going to be able to mimic with samples, but it's also very expensive. So even composers like John Powell, who did How to Train Your Dragon, Kung Fu Panda, and stuff like that. He's one of the biggest composers working today. He did Solo, the Han Solo Star Wars movie with John Williams as well. He does these full realistic mock-ups of all of his compositions with completely virtual instruments before they record it. So even if you have a chance to record it live, it absolutely never hurts to have a really realistic mock-up and work on skills like that, because when you send off a track or submit a track for a game or for a music library or something, they're going to look at that as how good you can make it with virtual instruments. And again, like recording with live musicians is expensive. I'm talking about like full orchestra, but it's also very common to have maybe a soloist come in. Like I work with a vocalist sometimes, or maybe hiring a cellist or something just to record like some solo lines, which can all be done remotely. So stuff like that is very common. But I'd say, for composers like me and people who aren't like super famous working on AAA games, and even in a lot of AAA games, it is pretty much 90% virtual instruments most of the time. Now, another question, what kind of portfolio should someone right out of school present to a prospective employer? Now, this is where I stress being versatile with what you compose. If you only compose action music, you're going to get a lot of jobs like that. But try always to write in genres that you aren't familiar with. Like a couple of years ago, I started writing ethnic music from China, from India, and stuff like that. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I've gotten gigs that just call for that. You know what I mean? I try to focus on having versatility because that is insanely important in today's market. Because another thing I mentioned in the article before, if you go out and you're set and you're saying, I only want to compose for video games, I will not write music for anything else, I can tell you're probably not going to go very far, or you're just going to get tired of waiting. Like, being a media composer is what it's about, and taking the jobs that are presented to you. If you want to do this full time, you're going to have to, take some risks, and it's going to be stressful sometimes because you don't know where your next gig is coming from and stuff like that. But every single job you take hones your skills a little bit more. So you say you do like a YouTube intro, even if your last project you made like $3,600, it's totally common and normal for your next project it might be $100. Right? Don't let everything go to your head and be like, I only work for thousands of dollars. And back to your question, whatever the prospective employer wants to hear is what you should present in your portfolio. Kind of like how you tailor a resume. I have a lot of different skills. I've worked a lot of jobs over the years. And whatever job I was applying for, I tailored my resume to show that type of work. You know what I mean? Same thing with prospective employers, prospective clients. What they want to hear is ultimately what you have to write. So while you do have some insight and you can put your advice and opinions forward, in the end result, it's what the clients want, which can be frustrating sometimes, but they're the ones that are paying you to do this. So prospective employers, submit to them what they ask for, and only that. Now, VOD Music talked about the Metroid Prime trilogy, which I replied, I loved Metroid 2 Return of Samus on my old Game Boy. Metroid, really great sense of atmosphere with those music, even with the chiptunes and stuff. Really glad you took over the series. Thank you. And my defining moment, hearing Mozart on the radio for the very first time. That is awesome. I love hearing like those powerful moments like that we will always remember. For him, for Sheldon, it was Mozart. So a little classical influence there. Let's see. This Green Noise. I was a little child, but Final Fantasy VII Set the Sparkle. That is one of my favorites too. That menu theme. I'm hearing it right now in my head. It's so peaceful and so good. And recently I had the chance to get Complete 12 Ultimate. I think that is a really great place to start, especially because they have like the Symphony series and stuff like that now that they didn't have when I bought Complete Ultimate. But that's a really good package to get started with. Then we have 2 years ago, I listened to the Skyrim soundtrack. Absolutely. I remember Oblivion was the first Elder Scrolls I listened to, and I was absolutely blown away just at my friend's house. It was the first time I ever saw an Xbox 360, so I was like, the graphics were insane. My jaw dropped, and then I was listening to the music. I was like, dude, this is like a movie, you know? How essential is it to maybe own more than one good orchestral libraries? Well, I did talk about that in today's video. I think it's absolutely essential to kind of crafting your own sound, and also there is never going to be one library that does it all. Like I said, I love the sound of Spitfire, but sometimes I need something with more grit. Spitfire's so lush, it's so wet. And yeah, you said to combine different styles, tones, sounds, absolutely essential. In my opinion, every single professional working composer does this. And for example, blending together strings from Spitfire East-West, again, that would go back to the reverb. And it would also take a bit of experimentation with sending the East-West to a different kind of reverb, like that convolution reverb that emulates the sound of a hall. And finding, really, sometimes just use your ears and find whichever matches the Spitfire Air Studios sound the most, and then sending them both through a really light algorithmic reverb will make them even more sound like both of those instruments or both of those libraries were recorded and are placed in the same space. Found out the best way to make orchestral music more expressive and dynamic. Should I use faders, pedal, breath control? What I do, honestly, I paint everything in. I draw everything in inside of my DAW. If I'm playing live, I just use the mod wheel, or I also map different sliders up here to expression or vibrato. I think the absolutely most important to make things sound expressive and dynamic are what I just mentioned. Velocity or dynamics, which is usually mapped to CC01, which by default is this mod wheel right down here, and then vibrato, which is especially for strings, that's absolutely essential because they're not going to be playing with full vibrato the whole time. It's going to kind of swell up. So I think those two in particular for me are absolutely the most important. And usually I don't use a breath controller, I don't use a pedal, I use the wheel and I use the knob, and more importantly, I draw everything inside of my inside of my piano roll. And like I showed you earlier, having those swells and dynamics, the vibrato would look the same way. I would have light vibrato coming in slightly, and then once those strings go and really are soaring, then I have the vibrato swell up and down just like the dynamics. All right, so I think that is all of the questions. This one I wanted to mention. My defining moment, putting Donkey Kong Country on pause just to listen to music. I can relate 100%. Donkey Kong Country, and again, I mentioned the Game Boy. I had Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy, and that the Jungle Hijinks song was just so so catchy to me, and I absolutely loved it. So, topics of interest for Jean of Mark: dynamic music, setting up a sample server, Vienna Ensemble Pro, ways of speeding up the process, and comparing symphony orchestra libraries. Absolutely. So thank you guys for your comments. And absolutely keep them coming on this episode, because we're going to have a lot more and a lot more in-depth topics for you guys. So thank you guys so much. Make sure to stay tuned, because we have a lot more great content coming for you. I know this is a long video. Thanks for sticking it out with me. This has been Battle Music, more basic sci-fi, fantasy battle music, and a little bit about some basic loops as well. So thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time.